Dr. Julian Thorne loved the snow. It covered the dirt of Dusty Creek, turning the rough frontier town into something pure and silent. He sat in his clinic, polishing his glasses by the light of a kerosene lamp. It was nearly midnight. The blizzard outside was howling like a banshee, rattling the window panes. No one would be out on a night like this. Julian stood up to lock the front door. He was a tall man, thin but wiry, with gentle eyes that had seen too much death but never lost their kindness. He wasn't a fighter. He was a healer. Just as his hand touched the bolt, the door exploded inward. A gust of freezing wind and snow blasted into the room, extinguishing the lamp instantly. Julian stumbled back, shielding his face. "Don't move," a voice hissed from the darkness. It was a woman's voice, hoarse, strained, and dangerous. Julian fumbled in his pocket for a match. He struck it against the wall. The flare of light revealed his visitor. She was leaning against the doorframe, barely standing. She wore a heavy duster coat that was dark with moisture, a black Stetson hat pulled low, and two heavy revolvers strapped to her hips. But what caught Julian's eye wasn't the guns. It was the blood. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the side of her coat. She was clutching her abdomen, her knuckles white. I need a doctor," she gasped, raising one of the revolvers with a shaking hand to point it at his chest. "Fix me, or I shoot." "You don't need the gun, miss," Julian said calmly, his voice steady despite the threat. "I'm a doctor. I help anyone who walks through that door. Put it down." The woman tried to step forward, but her legs gave out. She collapsed, face forward onto the floorboards with a heavy thud. The gun skittered across the floor. "Miss," Julian rushed to her side. He turned her over. She was young, perhaps 25, with sharp features and fiery red hair that spilled out from under her hat. Even pale from blood loss, she was striking a wild, untamed beauty. He quickly checked her pulse. It was thready and fast. He unbuttoned her heavy coat. Underneath, her shirt was soaked in blood, a gunshot wound, just above the hip. Nasty. "You're in bad shape," Julian muttered to himself, his healer's instinct taking over. He lifted her in his arms. She was lighter than she looked, shivering violently from the cold and shock. He carried her to the operating table in the back room and laid her down. He quickly lit the overhead lamps, flooding the room with light. He washed his hands, grabbed his scalpel and forceps, and cut away the bloody fabric of her shirt. The bullet was still inside. "Okay," Julian whispered, looking at her unconscious face. "Let's see if I can save you before you wake up and try to kill me." As he worked, cleaning the wound, he noticed a piece of paper sticking out of her coat pocket. Curiosity got the better of him. He pulled it out. It was a wanted poster. Wanted dead or alive. Cassidy, Wildcat Vance. Bank robbery and murder. Reward, $500. Julian froze. He looked at the poster, then at the woman on his table. He was harboring a notorious outlaw. The sheriff's office was just across the street. All he had to do was walk out and tell them. Cassidy groaned in her sleep, her brow furrowing in pain. "Please, Dot," she whispered, a sound so broken it didn't belong to a killer. "Don't let them ... catch me." Julian looked at the scalpel in his hand. He looked at the snow piling up against the window. He crumpled the wanted poster and threw it into the wood stove. It burst into flames. "Not tonight, Cassidy," Julian said softly. "Tonight, you're just a patient." He poured ether onto a rag and pressed it gently over her nose and mouth. Then he began to cut. Asterisk pain. That was the first thing Cassidy felt. A sharp, throbbing fire in her side. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was white timber, clean and unfamiliar. The smell of antiseptic. and wood smoke filled the air. She wasn't in a jail cell. She wasn't dead. Panic surged through her. She sat up too fast, gasping as her wound protested. Her hands flew to her hips. Her holsters were gone. Her guns were gone. She scanned the room wildly. It was a small recovery room. On a side table, a tray of surgical instruments glinted in the morning light. She grabbed a scalpel. It was small, but sharp enough. The door handle turned. Cassidy swung her legs off the bed, fighting the dizziness. She pressed her back against the wall behind the door. The scalpel raised. Dr. Julian Thorne walked in, carrying a steaming bowl of broth. He looked tired. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, suggesting he hadn't slept a wink. "Good morning," he said softly to the empty bed. Then he paused, noticing the tangled sheets. Before he could turn, Cassidy lunged. She slammed him against the doorframe, pressing the cold steel of the scalpel against his jugular vein. Her other hand gripped his collar, pulling him down to her level. "Where are my guns?" she snarled. Her face was pale, sweat beading on her forehead, but her green eyes were blazing. Julian didn't drop the soup. He didn't struggle. He just looked at her over the rim of his spectacles, blinking calmly. "You're going to tear your stitches," he said violently. Cassidy blinked, confused by his reaction. "Did you hear me, Sawbones? I asked where my guns are." "Top drawer of my desk," Julian answered evenly. "Unlocked, but they're empty. I took the bullets out." "Why?" "Because you were delirious with fever all night, and I didn't want you shooting my lamp," Julian said. "Now, please move the knife. This is a clean shirt." Cassidy hesitated. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a wave of exhaustion. Her hand trembled. She looked at this man, this tall, skinny doctor who looked like a strong wind could blow him over. He wasn't afraid of her. She lowered the scalpel. She stumbled back, clutching her side. Julian immediately set the soup down and guided her back to the bed. "Easy. You lost a pint of blood. The bullet grazed your liver. You're lucky to be alive. Why didn't you turn me in?" Cassidy asked, sinking into the pillow. "I know you saw the poster. $500 is a lot of money for a country doctor." Julian pulled a chair over and sat down. He picked up the bowl of broth. "I took an oath, Miss Vance," he said quietly, "to do no harm. Turning a patient over to a hangman feels like harm to me." He dipped a spoon into the broth and held it out to her. Cassidy stared at the spoon. She hadn't been fed by anyone since she was a child. She felt a strange lump in her throat. She took the spoon from him, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm. "I didn't kill that teller," she whispered suddenly. "The poster says murder, but it was my partner." He panicked. "I just wanted the money." "Eat," Julian said gently, ignoring the confession. "We can talk about morality when you have some color in your cheeks." Cassidy ate. The broth was rich and salty. For the first time in months, she felt safe. Bang, bang. The peace was shattered by a heavy fist pounding on the front door of the clinic. "Doc, open up." "Buzzes." A rough voice shouted from the street. "It's Bounty Hunter Silas." "We tracked the blood." "Trail to your porch." Cassidy froze. The spoon clattered into the bowl. The fear returned, sharp and cold. She looked at Julian. "They found me," she whispered. She tried to get up, but Julian put a hand on her shoulder. "Stay here," he ordered. His voice had changed. The gentleness was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. "He'll kill you if he finds me here," Cassidy hissed. "Give me my guns." "No." Julian stood up, buttoning his coat to hide his trembling hands. "If you start shooting, you die. I handle this." "How?" she asked, looking at the unarmed man. "You're just a doctor." Julian looked at her, and a small, enigmatic smile touched his lips. Exactly. And everyone in this town needs a doctor sooner or later, even bounty hunters. He walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the wolf to hide while the sheep went to face the pack. Julian smoothed his coat, took a deep breath, and opened the front door. A wall of muscle stood there. Silas was a bear of a man, wearing a wolf fur coat and carrying a sawed-off shotgun. Behind him, 2 other men peered into the clinic, snow accumulating on their hat brims. "Step aside, Doc," Silas grunted, pushing past Julian without waiting for an invitation. "We tracked a bleeder here. Wildcat Vance, $500 walking on 2 legs." "I have no patience by that name," Julian said calmly, closing the door to keep the heat in. "And I don't appreciate armed men tracking mud onto my clean floors." Silas ignored him. He crouched down, touching a dark spot on the floorboards that Julian hadn't scrubbed fast enough. He rubbed it between his fingers. "Blood," Silas grinned, standing up. "Fresh." "Mr. Abernathy," Julian lied smoothly. "He came in drunk an hour ago. Put his hand through a saloon window. I stitched him up and sent him home." Silas narrowed his eyes. He walked slowly around the room, sniffing the air like a hound. He stopped at the wood stove. He opened the hatch. The charred remains of the wanted poster had already turned to ash, but the smell of burnt paper lingered. "You burn a lot of paper." "Doc?" Silas asked suspiciously. "Old medical records," Julian replied, adjusting his glasses. "Now, if you don't mind, I have a clinic to run." Silas turned his gaze to the closed door of the back room, the operating room. "Is Mr. Abernathy in there?" Silas asked, nodding at the door. "No," Julian said. He stepped in front of the door, blocking the path. "That room is occupied, and it is strictly off-limits." "I'm a bounty hunter, Doc. Nothing is off-limits." Silas racked his shotgun. "Move." "I can't let you in there," Julian said, his voice dropping to a serious whisper. "For your own safety." Silas laughed. "I think I can handle a woman with a hole in her gut." He shoved Julian aside hard. Julian stumbled into a cabinet of medicine bottles, which rattled dangerously. Silas kicked the door open and stormed into the back room. The room was dim. The lamp was turned low. Lying on the operating table was a body, covered entirely by a white sheet. It was perfectly still. Silas marched up to the table. He reached out to rip the sheet away. "I wouldn't do that," Julian shouted from the doorway. Silas froze, his hand inches from the fabric. He looked back at the doctor. "Why?" "It's not the outlaw," Julian said, his face a mask of professional grimness. "It's Mrs. Gable. She passed away an hour ago." "From what?" Silas asked, skeptical. Julian took a step forward. "Black pox, highly contagious. The blisters burst right before the end. If you uncover her, you release the spores. You'll be coughing blood by sunset and dead by morning." Silas stared at the sheet. Beneath it, Cassidy held her breath until her lungs burned. She gripped her side to stop herself from trembling. The pain was agonizing, but fear was a potent anesthetic. Silas looked at the sheet. He looked at Julian. "You're lying," Silas sneered. But he pulled his hand back. Even the toughest gunman feared disease more than bullets. "Go ahead," Julian challenged him, gesturing to the table. "Look her in the face. But don't ask me to treat you when your skin turns black." The room was silent, save for the wind howling. Outside, Silas weighed the $500 reward against the horror of a plague death. He spat on the floor. "If I find out you're hiding her, Doc," Silas growled, backing away, "I'll burn this place down with you inside." "Understood," Julian said coldly. "Now get out. I have to prepare the body for burial." Silas turned and stomped out of the room, signaling his men to leave. The front door slammed shut, plunging the clinic back into quiet. Julian stood still for a full minute, listening until the horses rode away. Then his knees gave out, and he slumped against the doorframe, letting out a long, shaky exhale. He walked to the operating table. "You can breathe now," he whispered. Cassidy threw the sheet off, gasping for air. Her face was pale, sweat-soaking. Her hair. She looked at Julian with wide eyes. Black pox? She wheezed, a faint, impressed smile tugging at her lips. "That was your plan? It worked, didn't it?" Julian wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "You're a terrible liar, Doc," Cassidy chuckled, wincing as she sat up. "But you've got guts." "I prefer to think of it as creative diagnosis, Julian," said Dot. He walked over to check her bandages. They were spotted with fresh blood from the stress. "They're gone for now," Julian said seriously. "But Silas isn't stupid. He'll check with the undertaker about Mrs. Gable. When he finds out no one died, he'll be back." "Then I need to leave," Cassidy said, trying to swing her legs off the table. "You can't walk," Julian pushed her back down gently. "And you can't ride. In this storm, you'd freeze to death in a—" The cellar was cold, smelling of damp earth and preserved apples. It wasn't much of a sanctuary, just a hole dug beneath the clinic floor, lined with stone and stocked with root vegetables. For the winter, Julian carried Cassidy down the narrow ladder, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist to support her weight. She hissed in pain with every step, her sweat soaking into his shirt. He laid her on a makeshift cot he had fashioned from crates and wool blankets. "It's not the Grand Hotel," Julian apologized, hanging a lantern on a rusty nail. "But it's soundproof." Cassidy lay back, looking at the low timber ceiling. Dust motes danced in the lantern light. "I've slept in worse," she murmured. "Caves, barns, the saddle. This is luxury." Julian pulled up a crate and sat beside her. He checked her temperature. Her skin was still too hot. The infection was the real enemy now, not the bounty hunters. "I have to go back upstairs," Julian said quietly. "If the clinic stays closed, people will talk. I have to act normal, treat patients, smile at the sheriff." Cassidy grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were intense. "If they come back, Doc, double quotes," she started. "If they come back, you stay silent." Julian cut her off. "No matter what you hear, no matter what they do to me, you make a sound, and we both hang. Do you understand?" Cassidy looked at him. She saw the seriousness in his gentle face. He was risking everything: his career, his freedom, his life for a woman whose face was on a wanted poster. "Why?" she asked again. "You don't even know me." Julian paused. He took a damp cloth and wiped the sweat from her forehead. The gesture was shockingly intimate in the small, dark space. "My father was a judge," Julian said softly. "He believed the law was black and white. He sent a man to the gallows for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving family. That day, I decided I didn't want to be a judge. I wanted to be the man who kept people alive, regardless of who they were." He stood up. "Rest, Cassidy. I'll bring food when I can." He climbed the ladder and closed the trapdoor, throwing a heavy rug over it to conceal the seams. 2 days passed. For Cassidy, time became a blur of darkness and fever dreams. She lay in the cellar, listening to the muffled footsteps of the doctor walking above her head. She learned his rhythm. Click-clack meant he was wearing his dress shoes seeing patients. Thud-thud meant boots. He was going out or coming in from the snow. Scrape meant he was moving the rug to come down to her. That sound became her lifeline. On the third night, the trapdoor opened. Julian descended, bringing a tray of stew and fresh coffee. He looked exhausted. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his tie was loose. "How is it up there?" Cassidy asked, sitting up. Her fever had broken. She felt weak, but clear-headed. "Tense," Julian admitted, handing her the coffee. "Silas is still in town. He's drinking at the saloon, asking questions. He knows no one died of black pox. He suspects I moved the body. He's waiting for you to slip up," Cassidy said, blowing on the coffee. "He's watching the house." "I know." Julian sat heavily on the crate. "I saw him across the street, watching my windows." "You should give me my guns," Cassidy said. "I can slip out the back. Make a run for the tree line. You'd make it 10 yards before he shot you." Julian shook his head. "Or your stitches would. Tear, and you'd bleed out in the snow. You're staying." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. "I thought you might be bored," he said shyly. "It's poetry. Lord Byron." Cassidy took the book. She looked at his hands' long, slender fingers that were stained with ink and iodine. Hands that saved lives. "I don't read poetry," Cassidy said, her voice rough. "I read maps and ransom notes." "Try it," Julian smiled faintly. "It might surprise you." Cassidy opened the book. She looked at him over the pages. The lantern light cast shadows that made his cheekbones look sharp. He wasn't a cowboy. He wasn't a roughneck. He was ... beautiful, in a way she hadn't understood. "Before, Julian," she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He looked up, startled. "My name isn't Cassidy," she whispered. "It's Catherine. Catherine O'Malley. My father ran a sheep farm in Wyoming. Until the cattle barons burned us out and shot him in the back. The law didn't do anything, so I bought a gun." She closed the book, her thumb tracing the leather cover. "I'm not a bad person, Julian. I just ... I stopped asking for justice, and started taking it." Julian reached out. He covered her hand with his. "I know you're not bad, Catherine," he said softly. For a moment, in the damp, cold cellar, the world above didn't exist. There was no bounty hunter, no storm, no law. Just a doctor and an outlaw, holding hands in the dark. Suddenly, a heavy thump echoed from the floor above glass. Shattered. Julian jumped up, his eyes wide. "That was the front window," he whispered. "Someone just threw a brick." "Silas," Cassidy hissed, reaching for her side where her guns used to be. "Stay here," Julian ordered, blowing out the lantern instantly. The clinic smelled of fear, and kerosene. Pike stood in the center of the waiting room, a lit lantern in one hand and a jug of fuel in the other. He kicked a stack of medical journals across the floor, splashing the liquid over the dry wood. "You think you're smart, Doc?" Pike sneered, his yellow teeth flashing in the gloom. "Silas thinks you moved the body, but I reckon you didn't have time. I reckon she's still here. Maybe under the floorboards? Maybe in the walls?" Julian stood between Pike and the rug that covered the trapdoor. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But he didn't move. "There is no one here," Julian said, his voice steady. "You're committing arson, Pike. That's a hanging offense." "Only if there's a witness," Pike grinned. He swung the heavy kerosene jug. It struck Julian hard in the chest. Julian gasped, the air driven from his lungs. He stumbled back, crashing onto the rug right on top of the trapdoor. He groaned, clutching his ribs. Pike stepped forward and kicked Julian in the stomach. Julian curled into a ball, coughing. "Last chance, Sawbones," Pike hissed, raising the lantern. "Give her up, or you burn with the building." Julian looked up. Blood trickled from his lip. He thought of Catherine in the dark below. He thought of her hand in his. "Go to hell," Julian wheezed. Pike shrugged. "Have it your way." He threw the lantern at it. smashed against the wall. The kerosene-soaked wood caught instantly. A wave of fire roared to life, climbing the curtains, licking at the ceiling. The heat was immediate and intense. Pike turned to leave, chuckling to himself. He reached for the doorknob. Creak. The sound came from the floor. Pike paused. He looked back. The rug shifted. Julian, half conscious, rolled off it. The trapdoor underneath burst upward with desperate strength. Pike narrowed his eyes. Well, He drew his revolver, aiming it at the hole in the floor. Come on out, rat. Come get some cheese. A shape rose from the darkness. It wasn't a cowering woman. It was a blur of movement. Cassidy surged up from the cellar. She ignored the pain in her stitched side. She ignored the fever. She held the heavy book of poetry Julian had given her in her left hand, and something shiny in her right. Pike fired. Bang! The bullet splintered the doorframe as Cassidy threw the heavy book. It spiraled through the air and struck Pike square in the nose, blinding him for a split second. It was all she needed. She launched herself across the room. She collided with Pike, driving him back against the burning wall. Her scream of exertion mixed with the roar of the fire. Pike roared in pain as the flames licked his coat, but he was strong. He grabbed Cassidy by the throat, lifting her off her feet. Gotcha, you little witch, he yelled, raising his gun to her head. Cassidy's eyes were cold. She didn't struggle for air. She raised her right hand. She was holding the scalpel she had, stolen from the tray on her first night. I'm not a witch, she rasped. I'm a surgeon. She drove the scalpel down. Not into his neck. She didn't have the angle, but deep into the wrist of his gun hand. Pike screamed, dropping the revolver. His grip on her throat loosened. Cassidy dropped to the floor. She kicked the gun away into the flames. Pike clutched his bleeding wrist, stumbling back. The fire was spreading fast now, consuming the front wall. Smoke filled the room, thick and black. You're dead, Pike howled, backing toward the door. Silas is outside. You're dead. He fumbled for the latch, threw the door open, and stumbled out into the snow, screaming for help. Cassidy stood swaying in the center of the inferno. The heat was searing her skin. She looked down. Julian was lying on the floor, coughing, barely conscious. The smoke was getting to him. She rushed to him, grabbing his collar. Julian! She screamed over the noise of the fire. Get up! He blinked, his eyes unfocused behind cracked glasses. Catherine. Run. Not without you, she growled. She grabbed. His arm hauled him up. Her side felt like it was ripping open, wet warmth spreading across her shirt. She ignored it. The front door was open, but Pike and Silas would be waiting there with guns drawn. The back, Julian coughed, pointing weakly. The back door. They stumbled through the smoke, past the operating table where they had met, past the cabinets of medicine exploding from the heat. They reached the back door. Cassidy kicked it open. The cold night air hit them like a hammer. They fell out into the alleyway, into the deep snow, gasping for breath as the clinic behind them turned into a torch that lit up the entire town. We have to move, Cassidy whispered, dragging Julian up. Before they circled back, she looked at the burning building. Her sanctuary was gone. Julian's life's work was gone, and it was her fault. I'm sorry, she whispered. Julian looked at her, soot covering his face, blood on his lip. He gripped her hand. Don't be, he said. I hated those curtains anyway.
A deep, resonant, and warm American male voice. The pacing should be slow, deliberate, and immersive, like a storyteller sitting by a campfire. The tone is soothing, but has a slight gravelly texture to reflect the rugged Western setting. Convey deep emotion and empathy, especially during dialogue. Pause slightly between sentences to let the story sink in. The wind howled through the alleyway, driving snow into their faces like shards of glass. Behind them, the clinic roared, the flames painting the swirling snow orange and black. Julian supported Cassidy's weight, his arm around her waist. She was stumbling, her breathing ragged. The adrenaline from the fight was fading, leaving only the cold and the pain of her reopened wound. "The livery stable," Julian shouted over the wind. "At the end of the street, we need horses." "I can't ride," Cassidy gasped, her legs buckling. "You have to," Julian said grimly, "or we die here." They reached the large barn doors of the livery. Julian shoved one open just enough for them to slip inside. The smell of hay, manure, and warm horseflesh surrounded them. It was dark, save for the faint light filtering in from the burning town down the street. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, smelling the smoke. Julian lowered Cassidy onto a pile of straw. She clutched her side, blood seeping through her fingers, staining the snow on her coat. "Stay awake," Julian ordered. He ran to the nearest stall, a sturdy roan mare. He didn't bother with a saddle, it would take too long. He grabbed a bridle from the wall and forced the bit into the horse's mouth. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the reins twice. He was stealing a horse. Julian Thorne, the man who paid his taxes early and tipped the grocer, was becoming a horse thief. "Well done, Doc," a deep voice rumbled from the shadows near the door. Julian froze. Silas stepped out of the gloom. He was singed, soot-stained, and looked like a demon rising from hell. He held his sawed-off shotgun leveled at Julian's chest. "Pike is crying like a baby outside," Silas growled, walking closer. "Says the little witch stabbed him, says you helped." "She's a patient," Julian said, stepping between Silas and the pile of straw where Cassidy lay. "She acted in self-defense." "She's a paycheck," Silas spat. He cocked the hammers of the shotgun. Click-clack. "And now, so are you, aiding and abetting. I might not get a bounty for you, Doc, but I'll enjoy watching you bleed." Julian looked around. He was unarmed. There was a pitchfork 3 feet away, but he'd never reach it in time. "Don't do it, Silas," Cassidy's voice came from the straw behind him, weak but venomous. "You kill him, and I'll haunt you to your grave." "I don't believe in ghosts," Silas sneered. He raised the gun. Julian's mind raced. He looked at the horse behind him, the roan mare. She was terrified, her eyes rolling white, smelling the smoke and the aggression. He looked at Silas. "You should check the horse's pulse," Julian said nonsensically. "What?" Silas frowned, confused. Julian didn't explain. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had left, a small glass vial of ammonia salts, smelling salts he used to wake fainting ladies. He crushed the vial in his hand and shoved it directly under the roan mare's nose. The sharp chemical sting hit the nervous animal like a lightning bolt. The horse screamed. She reared up, her front hooves lashing out in a frenzy of panic. Julian yelled, startled, and pulled the trigger. Boom! The shot went wide, blasting a hole in the roof as the massive animal bucked. The horse's flank slammed into Silas, knocking him backward into a pile of grain sacks. "Run!" Julian screamed. He didn't try to mount the roan, it was too crazy. He grabbed Cassidy, hauling her up. "The back door!" They scrambled toward the rear exit of the stable. Behind them, chaos erupted. The roan had kicked the stall door off its hinges and was stampeding around the barn. Other horses were panic-stricken, kicking and whinnying. Silas was struggling to get up, cursing, lost in the dust and kicking hooves. Julian kicked the rear door open. A black gelding, saddled and ready for the morning mail run, was tied to the hitching rail outside. "Get on!" Julian shoved Cassidy toward the horse. She groaned, grabbing the saddle horn. She dragged herself up, nearly falling, but managed to straddle the beast. Julian vaulted up behind her, grabbing the reins. "Yah!" He kicked the horse's ribs. The gelding bolted forward, plunging into the deep snow of the open plains. Behind them, Silas stumbled out of the barn door, reloading his shotgun. He fired one last desperate shot into the dark. Whiz! The slug tore through the collar of Julian's coat, missing his neck by an inch. They didn't look back. Julian leaned forward, shielding Cassidy from the wind with his own body, steering the horse toward the dark, unforgiving tree line of the Blackwood forest. The clinic was gone. The town was gone. They were alone in the storm.
The wind howled through the alleyway, driving snow into their faces like shards of glass. Behind them, the clinic roared, the flames painting the swirling snow orange and black. Julian supported Cassidy's weight, his arm around her waist. She was stumbling, her breathing ragged. The adrenaline from the fight was fading, leaving only the cold and the pain of her reopened wound. "The livery stable," Julian shouted over the wind. "At the end of the street. We need horses." "I can't ride," Cassidy gasped, her legs buckling. "You have to," Julian said grimly, "or we die here." They reached the large barn doors of the livery. Julian shoved one open just enough for them to slip inside. The smell of hay, manure, and warm horseflesh surrounded them. It was dark, save for the faint light filtering in from the burning town down the street. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, smelling the smoke. Julian lowered Cassidy onto a pile of straw. She clutched her side, blood seeping through her fingers, staining the snow on her coat. "Stay awake," Julian ordered. He ran to the nearest stall, a sturdy roan mare. He didn't bother with a saddle, it would take too long. He grabbed a bridle from the wall and forced the bit into the horse's mouth. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the reins twice. He was stealing a horse. Julian Thorne, the man who paid his taxes early and tipped the grocer, was becoming a horse thief. "Well done, Doc," a deep voice rumbled from the shadows near the door. Julian froze. Silas stepped out of the gloom. He was singed, soot-stained, and looked like a demon rising from hell. He held his sawed-off shotgun leveled at Julian's chest. "Pike is crying like a baby outside. Says the little witch stabbed him. Says you helped." "She's a patient," Julian said, stepping between Silas and the pile of straw where Cassidy lay. "She acted in self-defense." "She's a paycheck," Silas spat. "And now so are you, aiding and abetting. I might not get a bounty for you, Doc, but I'll enjoy watching you bleed." Julian looked around. He was unarmed. There was a pitchfork 3 feet away, but he'd never reach it in time. "Don't do it, Silas," Cassidy's voice came from the straw behind him, weak but venomous. "You kill him, and I'll haunt you to your grave." "I don't believe in ghosts," Silas sneered. He raised the gun. Julian's mind raced. He looked at the horse behind him, the roan mare. She was terrified, her eyes rolling white, smelling the smoke and the aggression. He looked at Silas. "You should check the horse's pulse," Julian said nonsensically. "What?" Silas frowned, confused. Julian didn't explain. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had left, a small glass vial of ammonia salts, smelling salts he used to wake fainting ladies. He crushed the vial in his hand and shoved it directly under the roan mare's nose. The sharp chemical sting hit the nervous animal like a lightning bolt. The horse screamed. She reared up, her front hooves lashing out in a frenzy of panic. Silas yelled, startled, and pulled the trigger. Boom! The shot went wide, blasting a hole in the roof as the massive animal bucked. The horse's flank slammed into Silas, knocking him backward into a pile of grain sacks. "Run!" Julian screamed. He didn't try to mount the roan. It was too crazy. He grabbed Cassidy, hauling her up. The back door! They scrambled toward the rear exit of the stable. Behind them, chaos erupted. The roan had kicked the stall door off its hinges and was stampeding around the barn. Other horses were panic-stricken, kicking and whinnying. Silas was struggling to get up, cursing, lost in the dust and kicking hooves. Julian kicked the back door open. A black gelding, saddled and ready for the morning mail run, was tied to the hitching rail outside. "Get on!" Julian shoved Cassidy toward the horse. She groaned, grabbing the saddle horn. She dragged herself up, nearly falling, but managed to straddle the beast. Julian vaulted up behind her, grabbing the reins. "Hia!" He kicked the horse's ribs. The gelding ulted forward, plunging into the deep snow of the open plains. Behind them, Silas stumbled out of the barn door, reloading his shotgun. He fired one last desperate shot into the dark. Whiz! The slug tore through the collar of Julian's coat, missing his neck by an inch. They didn't look back. Julian leaned forward, shielding Cassidy from the wind with his own body, steering the horse toward the dark, unforgiving tree line of the Blackwood forest. The clinic was gone. The town was gone. They were alone in the storm. The horse collapsed 2 miles into the tree line. It didn't die, but it sank into the deep drift, shivering and refusing to rise. "It's done," Julian gasped, sliding off the saddle. The snow was waist-deep here. The wind sounded like a freight train. He reached up and pulled Cassidy down. She was dead weight in his arms. Her skin was ice-cold, her lips blue. The blood on her coat had frozen into a dark, stiff crust. "Leave me," she mumbled, her words slurred. "Save yourself, Doc." "Shut up," Julian said, his teeth chattering. "I didn't burn my clinic down just to freeze to death in the woods." He saw a shape through the swirling white, a low timber structure half buried in a drift, an old trapper's cabin. He dragged her toward it. Every step was a battle against the wind. He kicked the door in. It was empty, smelling of rot and old fur, but it was out of the wind. There was a stone fireplace and a rusted iron pot. Julian laid Cassidy on the floor. He scrambled to the fireplace. By some miracle, there was a stack of dry wood in the corner. He used his last match. The bark caught. A small flickering flame grew into a life-saving fire. He turned back to Cassidy. She was unconscious. He tore her shirt open. The stitches he had put in so carefully had ripped apart during the fight and the ride. The wound was open and bleeding sluggishly. "I don't have my bag," Julian cursed, patting his empty pockets. "No needle, no thread." He looked around the cabin frantically. He saw a hunting knife stuck into the log wall, rusted, dull, and dirty. He looked at the fire. He looked at the knife. He knew what he had to do. It was barbaric. It went against everything he had learned in medical school, but it was the only way to stop the bleeding and kill the infection. "I'm sorry, Catherine," Julian whispered. He thrust the blade of the knife into the heart of the fire. He waited until the metal glowed cherry red. He ripped a piece of his own shirt off and rolled it into a gag. He pried Cassidy's mouth open and placed it between her teeth. "Wake up," he shook her shoulder. "I need you to wake up and hold on." Cassidy's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, then at the glowing knife in his hand. She understood instantly. Fear, raw and primal, filled her eyes. She nodded once. She bit down on the cloth. Julian took a deep breath. 1, 2... He pressed the red-hot steel against her wound. The sound of sizzling flesh was sickening. Cassidy arched her back off the floor. A muffled scream tore through her throat that was worse than any gunshot. Her hand flew up and gripped Julian's wrist, her nails digging into his skin until they drew blood. Julian didn't pull away. He held the knife steady, tears streaming down his own face. "It's over," he sobbed. "It's over." Cassidy slumped back, passing out from the pain. Julian threw the knife into the corner. He curled up beside her on the floor, pulling his coat over both of them. He held her tight, sharing his body heat, listening to the wind howl outside, praying that the fire wouldn't go out. Morning broke with a blinding, diamond-hard silence. The storm had passed.
Julian awoke to the smell of wood smoke and pine. He was stiff, cold, and hungry. He looked down. Cassidy was awake. She was watching him. Her face was pale, gaunt, but her eyes were clear. The fever was gone. "You branded me," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I cauterized the wound," Julian corrected gently, brushing hair from her forehead. "It stopped the bleeding." "I'm going to have an ugly scar," she tried to joke, but it came out weak. "It matches the one on your soul," Julian smiled tiredly. Cassidy reached up and touched his face. She traced the bruise on his jaw where Pike had kicked him. "You're not just a doctor anymore, Julian," she said softly. "You're an outlaw now. You can't go back." "I know," Julian said. He looked at the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the logs. In the silence of the cabin, surrounded by snow, there was a peace they both knew wouldn't last. Crack! A bullet punched through the timber wall, inches above Julian's head. Splinters sprayed into his hair. "Morning, lovebirds."
Silas stepped onto the porch. He was close enough now that Julian could smell the stale tobacco and sweat on him. The bounty hunter stopped. He grinned, his eyes flicking to Julian's right hand hidden behind his back. "You're holding that poker like a golf club, Doc," Silas sneered. "You think you can hit me before I put a bullet in your chest?" Julian didn't move. "I know exactly where to hit to stop a heart, Silas. I've restarted enough of them." Silas laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You're a healer, Thorne. You don't have it in you." He moved lightning fast. He swung the butt of his rifle, catching Julian in the ribs. Crack! Julian gasped, the poker flying from his hand. He collapsed onto the snowy boards, wheezing. Silas stood over him, cocking the lever of his rifle. "Stick to bandages, Doc." He raised the barrel, aiming between Julian's eyes. "No!" Cassidy lunged from the doorway. She didn't look like a wounded woman. She looked like a fury. She drove the rusted hunting knife downward with both hands. It sank deep into Silas's thigh. Silas roared in pain. He spun around, backhanding Cassidy with massive force. She flew backward, hitting the log wall and sliding down, clutching her reopened wound. The knife remained stuck in Silas's leg. "You little witch!" Silas screamed. He turned the rifle toward her. "I'll blow you apart." Julian looked up. He saw the woman he loved about to die. He saw the rifle barrel stabilizing. Time seemed to slow down. Julian looked at the snow. Lying next to his hand was not the poker, but Silas's revolver, which had fallen from his holster when Cassidy stabbed him. Julian Thorne had never fired a gun at a man. He had spent his life fixing the holes they made. But he knew anatomy. He knew that a fraction of an inch changed a wound from painful to fatal. He grabbed the gun. He didn't aim for the chest. He didn't aim for the head. He raised the weapon with a steady surgeon's hand. Bang! The shot rang out, echoing through the mountains. Silas stiffened. He dropped his rifle. He reached up slowly to touch his neck. The bullet had severed the carotid artery. A clean, precise shot. He looked at Julian with shock. He tried to speak, but only gurgled. He collapsed face first into the snow, the red stain spreading instantly. Silence fell over the clearing. The 3 deputies in the trees watched in horror. They saw the invincible Silas fall. They saw the pacifist doctor holding a smoking gun with terrifying calmness. Julian stood up. He didn't drop the gun. He turned to the trees, his voice projecting cold authority. "He touched the body, the mist from the lungs. He's infected. If you come closer, you die." He pointed the gun at the deputies. "Leave, or I put you on my table." The deputies looked at the dead bounty hunter. They looked at the crazy doctor and the plague-ridden woman. Fear won. They turned their horses and galloped away, kicking up clouds of snow, terrified of the invisible death. Julian watched them go. Then he dropped the gun. His hands started to shake. He turned to Cassidy. She was looking at him with awe. "Nice shot, Doc," she whispered, a weak smile on her lips. Julian rushed to her, falling to his knees. He didn't care about the cold. He didn't care about the body on the porch. He pulled her into his arms. "I broke my oath," he whispered into her hair. "I did harm." Cassidy reached up, wiping a smudge of gunpowder from his cheek. "You saved a life, Julian," she said softly. "Mine. That still counts." Epilogue. 6 months later. The sun beat down on the dusty streets of San Lorenzo, a quiet village south of the Mexican border. A small adobe building stood at the edge of town. A hand-painted sign hung above the door, Clinica. Inside, the room was cool and smelled of sage. Julian Thorne was wrapping a bandage around a little boy's scraped knee. "All done, Mateo," Julian smiled, handing the boy a piece of hard candy. "Stay off the rocks." The boy ran out, shouting happily. The curtain to the back room pushed aside. Cassidy walked in. Her red hair was tied back, and she wore a simple white dress, but the Colt revolver strapped to her hip was unmistakable. The scar on her side had healed into a silver line, a permanent memory of the fire. "Lunch is ready," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "and I think I saw the sheriff riding by. He waved." "Did he wave or did he check his holster?" Julian asked, wiping his hands on a towel. "Both," Cassidy grinned. "He knows better to mess with the doc's wife." Julian walked over to her. He took her hands that no longer stole, but helped him mix medicines and tend the garden. "Any regrets?" he asked, looking into her green eyes. "Missing the thrill?" Cassidy looked around the simple clinic. She looked at the man who had burned down his life to save hers. She pulled him close for a kiss. "I found the only thrill worth dying for, Julian," she whispered, "and I intend to live for it." Outside, the wind blew across the desert, erasing their tracks, leaving Dr. Thorne and the wildcat to write their own story in the sand. The end.